Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video I'm going to try and answer a question that I know causes some people a lot of confusion. And it's this. It sounds like a joke, but it isn't a joke. What's the difference between a dominant seventh and a German sixth? Lots of people say, well, it's the same thing, sounds exactly the same, so why are you trying to make a distinction between the two? Well, there is a distinction to be made, and it's quite an important one. So that's what I want to try and get to today. So on the board, I've written a dominant seventh chord in the key of D flat and a German sixth chord in the key of C. And they sound like the same chord. So here is the dominant seventh chord in D flat major. I've just arranged the notes as A flat, G flat, A flat and C. So there's my chord, but of course the chord is in a kind of close position, A flat, C, E flat, G flat. Now in the case of the German sixth, well, the chord sounds the same because it's A flat, C, E flat, F sharp. So that's the difference. It was G flat when I was talking about a dominant seventh in D flat. Now I'm talking about a German sixth in C. I'm calling that F sharp instead of G flat. So lots of people hear that and say, well, it's exactly the same chord, isn't it? So why are we making this distinction between what would be a dominant seventh in D flat and a German sixth in C? Well, it's about that difference between the F sharp and the G flat. So we'll come back to that very shortly. First of all, let's just make sure we understand what we're talking about. What is a dominant seventh in the key of D flat? Well, a dominant chord is a chord built on the fifth degree of the scale. So D flat major, D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, B flat, C, D flat. So the fifth degree of the scale is A flat. So the dominant chord is that A flat with a third above it, that's C, and a fifth above it, E flat. So if I want to make it a seventh, I'm just adding a seventh above the root, G flat. So that's my dominant seventh, my 5/7 chord in D flat major. Okay, that's how we arrive at this chord. How do we arrive at this chord? Well, the German sixth is one of three augmented sixth chords. We've got the Italian sixth, the French sixth, and then we've got the German sixth. And the way we find the chord, just to give you a recipe for this, if I'm in the key of C, okay, so let's start by thinking, well, the C is my tonic. In order to form this chord, I find the lowered sixth above that C if I'm in a major key. So I'm in C major, the lowered sixth is A flat. Above the A flat, I'm going to form an augmented sixth. So an augmented sixth above A flat is F sharp. Then I put the tonic in the middle, the first note of the scale, so that's C. And that's the basic generic augmented sixth chord. Now, if I double up that C somewhere, or even if I just leave it like this, that's also known as the Italian sixth. If I add an augmented fourth above the bottom note, so the bottom note is A flat, an augmented fourth above that is D. So if I put a D into that chord, so A flat, C, D, F sharp, that's now a French sixth. Alternatively, if I add a perfect fifth above that bottom note, I'll get a German sixth. So that's going to be the A flat, the F sharp, the C that we had. But a perfect fifth above A flat at the bottom is E flat. And so this is the German sixth, A flat, C, E flat, F sharp. Okay, so that's how we arrive at the German sixth. So hopefully you can see that in fact when I calculate a dominant seventh in D flat, I'm doing that by a completely different way from how I calculate the German sixth in the key of C. We're even in two different keys, but we end up with a chord that sounds the same. Now, why then does it matter about, well, okay, you've got two chords that sound the same. What's all the fuss about? And why does it matter whether you call it G flat or F sharp? It's the same note, who cares? Okay, well, it's really about how the chord progresses. Because if this is a dominant seventh in D flat, well, it's going to progress in a particular way. Now, there are conventions about what we do with chords and harmony, and of course you can break with these conventions should you wish to, but it's always good to know what the conventions are because there's often a good reason for them. And one convention about how you resolve a dominant seventh, what we call voice leading, is that the seventh falls by step and the third rises by step. Okay, let's have a look at that. Well, the seventh is this G flat I've got in the tenor part. So if that's going to fall by step, then that G flat is going to go down to F. The C at the top is the third of the chord. So if that's going to resolve properly, it's going to rise by step. So I've already got those two things that need to happen if I'm going to resolve a dominant seventh according to convention. Now, if I end up with D flat and F, I've got two notes of the next chord. So if I've got D flat and F, I've either got the root and the third of a chord 1, a tonic chord, or I've got the third and the fifth of a chord 6, the submedian chord. So you'll find in many textbooks there's a rule that states if you have a 5-7 chord, you must always follow it with a chord 1 or a chord 6. In fact, that's not the rule. The rule is this: the seventh should fall by step and the third should rise by step. The consequence of doing that is that you end up following chord 5-7 with a chord 1 or a chord 6. Okay, so just to mop that one up. Now, if I decide then that I'm going to use a chord 1, say, well, then I've just got to complete the rest of the chord. So maybe I'm going to have a D flat in the bass, and I'm going to repeat A flat in the alto part. I could have gone to a chord 6. Maybe I could have organised the chord differently. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, this is one form of a 5-7 chord in D flat major. The third is rising, the seventh is falling. So I end up going 5-7 to 1 in D flat major. But what you're now hearing is the tonic chord of D flat major. And I'm very firmly in the key of D flat major. And if I carry on, then I'm feeling very much rooted in D flat major. Okay, let's have a look at this German 6 in the key of C then. Now, what are the conventions about what we do with this? When we resolve one of these augmented 6 chords, where do we go with that? Well, the augmented 6 chords tend to progress to chord 5. They're known as predominant chords. Or sometimes they go to chord 1 in second inversion before they resolve to 5. So you either go straight to the dominant chord, or you go to 1 in second inversion, and that in turn takes you to the dominant chord. So, well, shall we do that just so we've got the idea as to how that would work? Now, this would be a German 6 in C major or in C minor, so it could be either. But for argument's sake, let's say we're in C major. And before anybody says, well, how can we be in C major if we've got A flat, E flat and F sharp? Because in C major you don't have any flats or sharps. That's because those are chromatic notes in C major. In other words, they're notes that don't belong to the scale of C major. Nevertheless, they belong to a chord that functions in the key of C major. So it's going on to a chord that belongs to the key of C major, even though it's got notes in it that don't belong. And that's why we call it a chromatic chord. This is a diatonic chord because it's in the key of D flat major. This is a chromatic chord in the key of C major using notes in this case that don't belong to C major. Okay, well, let's see if we can go from the German 6 to a 1 in second inversion. So we'll call that 1C, or you will sometimes know this as a 164 if you come from a part of the world that uses a different convention with this inversion numbering. And then we'll go on to a chord 5. Okay, so let's see if we can just make that happen. Let me just put in some notes here that would enable that. And we will end up with this. Okay, so what am I doing there? Let's just have a little play of that. Here's the German 6, and I'm going on to chord 1 in second inversion, followed by chord 5. Now, even though that first chord has all these chromatic notes, you can hear that it functions in the key of C major. So there's the German 6, here's the tonic chord in second inversion, followed by the dominant chord, and now I'm very much in C major, aren't I? So that's very much here. The dominant 7th is functioning in D flat major. Here, the German 6 is functioning in C major. So the two chords sound the same, but function very differently. This is a diatonic chord that has particular rules of engagement about how it resolves, and those rules really result in you moving to a 1 or to a 6. But in German 6 in C major, you've got a chromatic chord using notes that don't belong to the key, and that has also rules of engagement about how that resolves. So you can see that even though you start by listening to a chord that sounds exactly the same, when you hear that chord in no context at all, you don't know if that's a 5-7 in D flat major or a German 6 in C. But how they resolve and how they function within the context of the music matters hugely and takes them in a very different direction. So dominant 7th in D flat goes on to a tonic chord, in this case in D flat, whereas that German 6 in C major going on to a chord 1, a tonic chord in second inversion, followed by a dominant chord, a chord 5, and then carries on in C major. So it's about enharmonics. You know, what's an enharmonic? Means it sounds the same, but it looks different. F sharp sounds the same as G flat, but it looks different. And the implications of it looking different is that it functions in a very different way. So it would be wrong to write a German 6 in C with a G flat in it, in the same way that it would be wrong to write a 5-7 in D flat with an F sharp in it, which is why when you're writing these things, that's actually quite important. Now, of course, this opens up all sorts of opportunities. You might, for example, be playing a piece of music in C major, solidly in C major. Then you might say, oh, I'll have a German 6 and carry on in C major. Or you might say, well, I'll have a German 6, but you know what? Then I'll make an enharmonic change and I'll call that F sharp, G flat, and then I can carry on in D flat major. So it does give us opportunity to shift keys and so on. We can play with that enharmonic difference. But I'm hoping that this is clarified, that there's a very clear distinction between a dominant 7th and a German 6. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, we've got other videos on the channel that explore in a bit more detail how these augmented 6 chords work that you might want to have a look at. But also many courses on our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. So have a look there because there's lots more on theory. Our advanced theory course, for example, really goes into the detail of harmony. There's a Bach chorale course. There's all sorts of other stuff on there. So have a look there. And while you're on that homepage, you could also click on a link to Maestros, and that will tell you all about our global community that we have at Music Matters. All sorts of perks, including discounts on our online courses, and opportunity to meet once a month for our live streams, to interact with other people in the group, to submit compositions, performances, for one-to-one feedback on that stuff. So that's a great resource. So if you want to do that, have a look at Maestros and you'll discover all that we have to offer there.